Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for having me.
I'm super stoked. For those listening, George and I have been longtime colleagues at Center for Food Safety, for better or for worse. George, why don't you talk a little bit about the role you play at CFS?
Oh, definitely for better. Really excited about this podcast. I'm the legal director here at CFS, and I've been here my entire legal career, 17 years, 18 years or so. Um, at this point, I kind of oversee our legal operations and also am on our organizational management team. So we've got a team, 6, 7 lawyers, and I'm in charge of those operations. I also have my own docket and lead some cases as well as I'm second chair on other cases we have. Um, and then I have a range of policy things I do, legislative work, um, help out in all those other areas since we're a small nonprofit.
George, for our listeners, I'd love for you to break it down. Like, what is CFS in terms of its strategy for change?
Well, we like to think of ourselves with an outsized impact on everything from farm to fork as far as building a better food future. So you can think of us as maybe the NRDC of the food movement. That's not an apt comparison given that that organization is several, much greater than us, 100-fold greater than us as far as staff or budget. But that's the kind of impact that we'd like to have and the leadership that we'd like to have as far as the food movement. Um, and, we use all different levers of change to try to build a better food future and stop harm to the environment and health from the current industrial paradigm, industrial food production. But legal change and using the law as a tool for change is one of those probably are what we're best known for and flagship part of what we do.
For our listeners, George and I are recording this the day after a draft decision had been leaked on Roe v. Wade. And I think it's sitting heavily for George and I about the status of our judicial branch, but all the more reason to help folks understand the role of the courts in social change. So I wanted you to hone in on, like, what is public interest law? Who practice it? How is it different than criminal law or civil procedure? What does it do?
Yeah, and I before getting to that, I would say that obviously it was a huge news earlier this week having to do with the Dobbs decision being leaked. But as far as this podcast, one thing I think it really does show is um, that you can effectuate that change, the elimination of the right of privacy of women's right to choose, that that decision portends for this summer is a huge social change that's going to be brought about by litigation and through the courts, a 30-year project from the hard right to create that. And obviously, that's a terrible tragedy, but it does show the power that the courts have and can have for good and have had in the past and can again if we emphasize, I think, on in the progressive circles, the importance of um, the courts and the importance of having good judges that understand humanity and people's rights and what the public believes should be enshrined and protected by the Constitution and by other laws. So, and public interest law, just to segue to your question, Ashley, is a big part of that. I mean, one way to think about it is that 99.9% of lawyers and uh, attorneys, they wait for somebody to come in their office and give them some money to solve a personal problem that they have. Whether that's a small thing like write a will for me or a big thing. I got hit. I slipped in a store and I'd like to sue the store owner for the damage from my hurt back, having to go to the doctor about that. What we do is fundamentally different than that, and I think fundamentally different than 99.9% of what um, private lawyers do. And in the public interest, we don't necessarily wait for a client to walk in the door. We don't take money from a client. Instead, we are proactive, like artists. We're able to create on a blank canvas where we can see pain and we can see struggle, whether that's in ecosystems for animals and the environment, or for people and their health, or for communities that are being adversely impacted in some way. And we then try to use the law as a tool to bring about betterment, to bring about change, and we have to stretch different muscles legally to do that, and we have to create cases that will encompass that. And the goal of our cases are not to make money. The goal of our cases are not to solve a problem for one person. So those are the goals for most people that use the law: to make money for themselves or their client, to fix a problem for one individual. We use the law to try to make the world a better place for everybody. Yes, we have clients that we need to be able to go to court, so they're affected maybe a little more directly. But the remedies that we seek in court, the relief that we seek in court, is to try to help everyone, to try to have a better environment, a more sustainable, more regenerative food system, um, to stop foodborne illness, things like that, that will have broader societal effects and change the law in a positive way to build a better legal system, but also to have these exterior effects on our social contract, the way that we view our society in these ways. So that, I think, is um, excuse me, makes us stand apart as far as what public interest law does. And we're certainly not alone in doing that. There are lots of wonderful people doing it in our community that we work with, but it's a small community compared to the broader legal community that um, of lawyers.
So let's go back to little George. Little George, what's your journey to public interest law?
Oh, um, you know, I think it's a bit meandering overall. I mean, I think that, I had, like most kids, different childhood dreams of what maybe you wanted to be when you grew up. There was a period where I was pretty certain I was going to be the second baseman for the New York Mets. And then when that failed, I thought maybe I just would be the radio broadcaster for the New York Mets because if I wasn't good enough to play second. Um, and then as I got a little older, I really loved history, 19th century history. I grew up in a small town that was centered on a Civil War battlefield, and that really affected me. And I would, volunteer there at one of the local Civil War museums, starting at about 8 or 9, giving tours, naming everything inside the museum, studying the battlefield. So for a while there, I thought I would be a professor of history and write books about that period of time and lessons we can take from it. Being a contextualist, drawing from the past and what lessons, which seem particularly salient right now in the struggles that we face as a society. Some of those same battles that we've fought over and over again through our history. But overarchingly, I think it was the environment and love for nature, and in particular rivers, that kind of overcame that as a young man, and spending time in nature, as a devoted fly fisherman and outdoorsman, someone who felt very at home there. That is where kind of my fountain of spirituality came from, and just feeling a desire and a vocation really to protect natural places for the future fiercely. And of course, um, being related to Andy and having CFS be part of our familial shared business, having this be a multi-generational family business in the best sense of those terms. He was a great mentor and influence on me as well. But I never thought that I would work in food law necessarily. I thought I would, if I went to law school, then I would work at kind of a more traditional green group. So when I chose a law school, I chose Lewis and Clark, kind of the #1 environmental law school in the country out here in Portland, Oregon, where I live now, and where I teach food and agriculture law. Um, because of that program, I looked at some bigger law schools, got accepted to some, but that's the one that really pulled me because I kind of knew that I wanted to do this public interest path, and I knew I wanted to do environmental law in particular. Um, but what I didn't realize at the time was that food law is kind of the new black. It's the 21st century's version of environmental law, and the what we eat and how we choose to eat is the greatest environmental decision and animal welfare decision that we make every day. And so it created this huge opportunity marrying those concepts for me. And when I came out of school, that was just starting to explode in the early 2000s, and the awareness of that, CFS being one of the groups that had been doing that work for some time already. Prior to law school, I had interned at CFS in college for a summer, and enjoyed the David and Goliath element of that, enjoyed the work. Um, but I didn't really see myself working there. So when I finished at school, I went to work for a judge for a while, which was kind of an apprenticeship, which, was a seminal experience, and one that I probably learned as much as I did in my 3 years of law school as far as litigation and the law. And when that time finished, I was kind of thinking about different other paths, perhaps working at a law firm. Most people, do that. It's a much more lucrative path to take. Um, but yeah, again, Andy um, reached out and said, this is a war and you're drafted, and I'd like you to come and work with us. And I, never have regretted that decision. It's been a wonderful passion, personal and professional, to do the work. Um, that's, long story short, how I got here.
So you say this is a war. Why don't you tell folks what is the war?
Yeah, sorry for the military metaphor. I'm a little prone to those.
Well, we
You know,
know, born on a Civil War battlefield.
yeah, you know, I guess there are different visions of the future of our food and of our planet, competing visions that stem from what's known as the technological dilemma, right? The technological dilemma being that we are currently outstripping the world's resources, and the most obvious, illustration of that being climate change. We're literally causing the climate to collapse by humanity's activities on our planet. And, this is not a new debate. It's been going on for some time, but in the last several decades, you've had these two camps that have come along as far as how to address the technological dilemma when you are rapidly outstripping your planet's resources. On the one hand, technologists, technocrats, they think the answer is to try to double down on the industrialization of the planet. So everything should be better, more efficiently utilized for humanity's purposes. Genetic engineering is part of this. We should take plants, we should take seeds, and we need to make them more efficient for our own purposes. So we need to genetically modify, genetically engineer them to try to serve those purposes better, in the most part, by selling more pesticides is what they ended up being. Or nanotechnology is very similarly like this, except for changing things at the molecular level, again, to try to make them into a factory, make them into an industrialized process to serve our particular special purposes. Cloning is like this. Um, and so when you have problems, with regards to the food system, for example, industrial animal factories, animal agriculture, and you have billions of chickens and pigs and cows that are treated in inhumane conditions in these facilities. The answer from that perspective is not to try to um, dismantle those facilities, but instead to change the animal's very nature to better fit those factory um, conditions. So, genetically engineered cows or pigs that maybe don't feel pain as much, for example, or have less of their own natural behaviors, so they don't feel that confinement as much. You know, those types of things. Synthetic biology, another extreme form of genetic engineering. There's a very different way of looking at this problem of outstripping of the natural resources of the world. And it's not a new one, it's actually the oldest one, going back to native societies, which is that we need to reform and change our human activities and the way that we approach the natural world and produce food as part of that to mirror and model natural systems. So less straight lines and more circles, e eco-shed based food systems, not shipping food all over the world, um, allowing animals their natural behavior, eating seasonally, farming in a regenerative, healthy way, not separating animal agriculture from plant agriculture, eating less meat, so we or vegan or vegetarian in order to ameliorate the impacts on the climate and on the environment from those activities, and dismantling the current system, reshaping our food system and our processes as a species in order to stop the catastrophic change that we're causing to our planet. So that's the philosophical war that's going on. And I think the balance, the planet hangs in the balance, and the food system hangs in the balance. And we're reaching an important point, a pivotal point in that battle to determine what's going to happen for our children's generation and their children's generations beyond. So um, what we do is a very small piece of that. That's at 10,000 foot level, and a lot of the work that we do day to day at CFS and our legal team is stopping the bleeding of the industrial system and the harm that it's causing to health and to the environment and to animals. And then also simultaneously trying to shift the consciousness through the litigation, as I mentioned, both for its on the ground effects, but more broadly, raising awareness about these issues in the media, in the social consciousness, to change elections, to change how people view their own relationship with their food and with the native world. So we can have long-standing societal change and build a better planet and a better food system.
So George, what you're saying is in this moment, there is a clash of two visions of our planet. And the food system sort of sits at the nexus of those clashing views. And one view is the industrialized view of food and earth and animals, which is that we can engineer plants and animals and processes all for our human wants and needs. And some examples of that you mentioned are CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, genetically engineered animals and plants, specifically plants that have been genetically engineered primarily to withstand greater and greater applications of pesticides. That's sort of the Goliath in the room. And then we have the Davidian alternative, which reflects a lot of the values we see continuing in indigenous land-based cultures, which is to treat the earth, animals as a partner in this process. And I also heard you saying that this clash is sort of reaching an apex. And one example of that that's capturing the public's attention is the shifting of the climate. Although we all know also the ravaging of our oceans and rivers are equally as catastrophic. So I really appreciate you laying out that battlefield, so to speak. And then you said CFS plays this small role inside of that. And we talked a little bit about public interest litigation. I want you to bring us into your journey of realizing just how powerful the law can be in helping the Davids fight for the food system that can serve people and the planet.
Right.
Battles in the name of David.
Yeah. Well, the reason I like the David and Goliath metaphor is, of course, that David won, right? Because a lot of people feel hopelessness, especially now, and they feel things are just too dark and too heavy. And it's a great example of, and it wasn't luck that David won, right? If you analyze that battle, um, he was chosen because he had a particular skill that was underappreciated by the opposing side and likely um, uh, made them overconfident, and that allowed him to prevail using an older method of warfare that he was particularly good at in a battle of his choosing. Um, so anyway, there's a lot more to that. I have a long version of that. That's the short version, but that's one reason I really like that metaphor. I don't know. I mean, look, bottom line is give me the courts every day and twice on Sunday. I mean, I have written ballot initiatives. I've worked in our DC office and lobbied on Capitol Hill. And as far as I can tell, in our political process, it's controlled by dollars, it's controlled by corporate money. And we have a really hard time with elections, whether those are legislative elections for different measures or electing officials. I think at a local level, at a state level, that's a different story, and you really can effectuate great grassroots change there. We've been a part of that in various different arenas in which we work that I'm very proud of. Um, but overarchingly, what I've found is that in litigation, if you give me um, good facts and good law and a good story, I can win. We can win, and we have over and over again against whatever the opposition is, the biggest law firms in the country, the most powerful corporations in the world. And that's not something I've seen in those other arenas that feel like right now, unfortunately, they're a lot more captured by um, corporate power. Um, so to me, it's been a great lesson in how to be effective in bringing about change. And as I mentioned, I think through the litigation, you can win cases, and you want to do that to alleviate suffering on the ground, harm to the environment on the ground, protect endangered species on the ground, protect farmers that are trying to do it the right way on the ground from harm to them, or beekeepers or communities, impacted communities and their drinking water, whatever it is. But you're also shifting the cultural and kind of social contract around an issue by enshrining a harm in the law and codifying it in the law, making it matter in a way and in a legal way. And what I've seen is that when you're able to do that, it changes the conversation about the given topic in a way that can have long-standing positive change. So you have different language that you use when you speak about it. It's recognized as a negative impact or a positive outcome, and people approach it differently. And so maybe then you can also go to those other arenas, legislative arenas, um, um, marketplace arenas, and have success there because of the legal change and the recognition of whatever the issue is that you're trying to address. The story I like to give about this, one of the most prominent examples, has to do with climate change, and that's the Massachusetts v. EPA case, Environmental Protection Agency case in 2007. So most lawyers know about this case. It's the first Supreme Court case on the issue of climate change. What most people don't know is that the origin of that case was actually a legal petition by our organization in 1999, when larger green groups weren't really addressing the issue of climate yet. And that tiny legal petition went through the courts and eventually arrived at the Supreme Court. And this was earlier in my career. I was in DC at the time. I attended that Supreme Court argument. It was one of the first ones I saw in person. And in Washington, D.C. at that time, there wasn't a lot of conversation. The conversation about climate was, is it real? Is global warming a real thing? Is it really happening? And after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the petitioners in Massachusetts v. EPA, which by the time it got to the Supreme Court included lots of green groups as well as many states, including Massachusetts, that had come on board, that conversation overnight changed from is it real to okay, the Supreme Court said it's real, so now what are we going to do about it? And, shamefully, we haven't unfortunately done very much in the subsequent years at a federal level, which is a different conversation. But the point of the litigation was that it really shifted that conversation, I think, societally and in the halls of power in DC because of the case, because of this little case, this little petition that had started a few years before by a few small nonprofits.
I'd love to know another story, if you can kind of have us all sit on the floor in crisscross applesauce and hear you wax poetic about some of the battles you've faced. Can you tell us about another case you've taken to the Supreme Court and what was at stake and what ended up happening and what was protected and what shifted because of that work? And I think in the process, maybe highlighting what it actually involves to take a public interest case to the Supreme Court, because I think we're all wondering how these hard right activists did what they did with Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, well, I think a better example, a positive, progressive example that I study as a historian, contextualist, someone who looks to the past to try to find solutions for the future and the present, is the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s and the work of um, the NAACP legal fund and Thurgood Marshall and his team of lawyers there to end separate but equal and to win Brown v. Board of Education and more largely equality in the law. And I think was a multi-decade campaign of litigation, mostly in courtrooms all over the country, including the Deep South at that time, that eventually culminated in the decisions like Brown v. Board from the Supreme Court at that time. Now you had a very different Supreme Court, the Warren Court to the Roberts Court that we have now, which is a different conversation. But so you can see that you need a long-term vision, you need strategic planning. Another example would be Ruth Bader Ginsburg's work with the American Civil Liberties Union as an attorney before she became the infamous RBG on the court and a heroine there. She was a litigator who argued some of the most important cases on women's rights successfully to the Supreme Court in the 1960s and early 70s. And of course, at that time, the court was 9 white men, and she won those cases because she brought smart cases, strategic cases about enshrining these principles of equality under the Constitution. So but yeah, no, I mean, to your question, Ashley, I think, you know, the vast majority of our cases that we bring, either in state or federal court, are district court cases, sometimes at the Court of Appeals, either on appeal or directly. Much more rare since the Supreme Court hears so fewer cases. We have one other, myself personally, I have one other case that I was heavily involved in was the lead on the Geertsen Seeds Farm case in 2010, which was a case about farmers and genetically engineered crops, in particular a Roundup Ready alfalfa that Monsanto created that was resistant to its flagship pesticide Roundup. It was the first type crop that wasn't a um, perennial. It was an annual. Sorry, it wasn't an annual. It was a perennial crop. So you have all over out here in the West lots of feral alfalfa that grows 2 to 4 years and create kind of a transmission bridge where you can. It's also bee pollinated. It's not wind pollinated, and bees go between fields and pollinate at miles distance. So if you were trying to grow organic alfalfa or even just conventional non-GMO alfalfa, you have a real problem if there is going to be a genetically engineered variety because bees don't read signs. Bees just pollinate between fields. So in that case, we brought a challenge to the approval of this new genetically engineered crop on behalf of um, environmental organizations, several environmental organizations, including our own, but also several farmers that wanted to not grow Monsanto's alfalfa, wanted to continue to grow their family varieties, their open pollinated varieties that they had grown for generations. Um, and it was the first case of its kind that was heard under the National Environmental Policy Act, having to do with the duties of the government to really analyze impacts to endangered species and the environment, but also to farmers. What did it mean for farmers to lose that choice to grow the crop of their choice? And what were the impacts to them from that cross-pollination and the movement, the unintended movement to them of that genetically engineered material? And remember what I said before about the war of words. In the old days, before the alfalfa case, that was called advantageous presence. So, like, it was an advantage to you to have this Monsanto DNA in your crop. Well, we called it transgenic contamination or genetic contamination, which is that you have your own variety that you've grown throughout your family for generations, and now it has this patented DNA, which, by the way, the patent holder that can then sue you for patent infringement if it's in there from it. And this is a harm to you. This harms your rights to grow the crop of your choice and sell the crop of your choice to your customers. It hurts your livelihood. It's an economic harm, but it's also this irreparable harm. Irreparable is a legal term that means it cannot be remedied by money alone. It means it is a harm to you that is beyond just money damages. And a lot of what we do has to do with trying to stop irreparable harm. So anyway, we won that case at the
I'm going to
district
pause
court.
right there just because I think there's a couple things you said that I think are really important to sort of emphasize. And one is we just continue to want to challenge the notion that genetic engineering is about driving progress in our food system for these broadly held goals of like ending hunger or resisting climate change or fighting drought. I mean, what we work on as an organization is broadly addressing that these companies are genetically engineering plants largely to withstand the pesticides that they manufacture. And so in the case of alfalfa, just important for our listeners to understand that this is not a genetically engineered alfalfa that's meant to do anything more than deliver more pesticides into our environment. I really always want to pause there in this work that we do, because I think it gets lost on people. So I just wanted to pause there. And then the
Yes.
other thing that I heard you say is sort of in passing is this notion of irreparable harm and the tact that we take at Center for Food Safety or that public interest law firms take is not to remedy the one farmer who might have experienced contamination, but rather to change the laws and the governmental processes enforcing those laws to ensure that all people's harm is protected now. So we took that case against the government to say that they weren't fully understanding what was happening to organic or family bred alfalfa farmers.
Right. Yeah. And not protecting them, not considering their interests. And remarkably, there had been a number of Roundup Ready other crops, corn, soy, cotton, canola, that they had previously approved really blindly in the same way. So the win that we got in alfalfa meant that going forward, and since that time, this is around 2008, um, the government hasn't been able to do that. They've had to issue what's called environmental impact statements, which are these very long documents that document and analyze and consider, okay, how much pesticide increase into the environment is this crop going to cause if we approve it? Okay, is that pesticide going to drift to another farmer's crops or to a native ecosystem or a wildlife refuge and cause harm there to endangered species or native species or to the soil? Um, and are we going to still have a conventional and organic industry that's non-GMO if bees are cross-pollinating this stuff everywhere? So I think the win in that case on the merits was big in that it required the government to do a lot better as far as the transparency and the rigor in which they brought to these decisions. Um, anyway, the I think everything else you said actually was well summarized. The decision itself, we won at the district court, and long story short, we went up to the Court of Appeals and we won twice at the Court of Appeals, and thought the case was over since the Supreme Court doesn't really hear too many cases, 100 a year out of thousands that they're asked to hear. But Monsanto had intervened in the case, as often is the case, or the pesticide company in a lot of these pesticide cases we litigate, and asked the Supreme Court to hear the case, and they agreed to hear it. And so we went to the Supreme Court and litigated the case there. There, the issues were more about the remedy that the district court had put in place. The district court had given us two remedies, kind of a belt and suspenders approach, and we got out of the Supreme Court with the best result in the realm of reality, according to people a lot smarter than me, law professors that have analyzed the case. But the end result was that there wasn't genetically engineered alfalfa that was allowed to be marketed at the time. And we had, again, as I mentioned earlier, kind of enshrined these principles in the law that this type of movement was now a type of contamination. It was a type of biological pollution that was recognized for purposes of standing to go to court. It was recognized for purposes of the merits of our core environmental laws, like the National Environmental Policy Act, and it was recognized for purposes of remedies, like injunctions and like setting aside agency actions, wiping them out, striking them down. Um, so those were fundamental shifts that since that time have been different and improvements based on that case. Now, did it take several years off my life to go to the Supreme Court? Sure, probably. But it was. I think it's amazing. It's an amazing experience to um, be able to represent people and farmers, our two main clients in that case, Phil Geertsen and Pat Trask, and be at the Supreme Court with them for that argument. I'll never forget that day. So, it was one of those moments that you carry forward and draw from, in the work, especially, on the days where it does feel heavy, potentially, and you need to be able to draw from the well of those examples from the past and say, no, David won. We can win. We do win. Um, so
I want to think about the darkness with you for a minute, because I think, again, with this draft decision coming out of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade and now effectively making abortion illegal in almost half of the United States. Tell us a little bit about the challenges that you've faced in your work and sort of how your work has shifted because of these darker moments.
yeah, I mean, it's a much different environment right now in the courts than when I started out. I think the Trump years, unfortunately, had a lot to do with that. They're not just the three Supreme Court justices, but the 200 judges that Trump placed on the federal courts around the country. I think the Biden folks have done a really good job appointing not just uh, good judges, but diversity judges, judges that bring both personal and professional diversity to the courts. A lot of public defenders, a lot of people that have worked for nonprofits like ours. I'd like to see a few more environmental lawyers. Haven't seen that yet, but we've seen civil rights lawyers. and other public interest minded people. It just matters who the judges are. And I hope that I think progressive folks out there, the progressive movement, the Democratic Party, more generally, need to emphasize the importance of the courts. I mean, the reason the conservatives are at the precipice of getting their white whale that they've sought for 30 years as far as overturning Roe v. Wade is because they have done that in elections. They have made the courts an issue in elections. They've said, you need to vote for Trump because he's going to appoint judges that will help us overturn Roe v. Wade. The left has not done that. They have not emphasized the importance of courts. And the progressive voter, I don't think largely, and maybe now they will a little bit more. Um, but it's a much more treacherous waters. It's a much more treacherous environment for us to do the things I've been talking about to effectuate positive change because we have seen capture, regulatory capture, um, now more in the judicial branch. Um, and I think the understanding of the courts as another political branch, that it is not a neutral arbiter necessarily in the way that in the past people have seen it in a white tower. It is a political operating branch, just like the legislative branch, just like the executive branch. And again, I think the hard right has understood that for a while and has used that to their advantage successfully, whereas the progressive movement has failed to do that um, successfully. So, the challenges for us, as always, you have losses, and when you really care about your work, you take that to heart. You the blood and the sweat and the thousands of hours, the long nights and weekends. Um, it's a great blessing to really love what you do. But any vocation like that, when you lose, you take it very hard. So the trick is, I think, for people that want to be social change activists, whether they're lawyers or not, is you have to protect your sense of self from the work. So the work is over here, and you have to stay strong and you have to have other fountains of joy and fulfillment that you draw from besides the work otherwise will consume you. So for me, in large part, I love, as I mentioned, nature and fly fishing, camping, being outdoors. I love to garden and to be in my yard. And I love my family and my children. For me, they're the wellspring, and my wife, they're the wellspring of joy for me, that if I have a hard day, I can come home and see their smiles, and that helps me to get through those moments.
Can you tell us a little bit about a lesson that you learned in your last sort of dark night of the soul? Something that shifted in you as an activist or an advocate, whether it was like a doubling down on a strategy or a shifting in position, that others might be able to learn from your harder times.
Mm. So let me make sure I understand. Like a hard won lesson from the work that I draw from, or
Yep.
Mm. One of the mantras, I gave one mantra that already um, that we have here at Center for Food Safety, which is we stop the bleeding and we shift the consciousness through the work at the same time. Another one that helps me often is you you don't have to win, you just have to be faithful. So I have that mantra quite a bit, which is just generally the idea that it's enough to do the work and put it out into the universe, regardless of the outcome. If I feel like our team has done the caliber of work with honor that we can do using the tools we have and given it everything we have, um, then that's it. Then that's where we are, and there is victory in that. And then I think the other lesson that's much more of a I think wisdom age lesson is, sometimes when you lose, you still win. I've had that occur at a number of times where technically we lost a case, but because of the case, for whatever reason it was, we ended up having really positive effects um, from the effort expended on it in some way. And that's been very telling to me and helpful as well.
I want to talk a little bit about work-life balance, because I know that you do strive to play a role in your family's life and be a present father, and yet at the same time, you're running this small and mighty legal op, and serving in administrative and managerial roles, for better or for worse. How have you learned to balance that? Like, and and how does it continue to challenge you, as a leader and as a father?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I have an amazing partner who is also an accomplished lawyer in her own right. So she gets most of the credit for everything. So I would say, uh, you know, that's very important. That's been a wonderful piece of my life to be able to share with her the journey. And I mean, other than that, I think it's a little different for everyone. For me, as I mentioned, having um, being able to separate um, work life completely. I think during COVID, um, there's some wonderful things about working at home. You don't have to commute. You don't. You can work in your pajamas if you want. Um, but one of the problems for me is not having that physical separation from the work. So I'm here in my office today, and for a lot of COVID, I was lucky enough to be able to be here as well, and that helps me when I shut the door um, and leave the work here. Um, So I think it's a little different for everyone. Just ensuring that you have those activities. For me, it's fly fishing, going to Montana where I do quite a bit of fly fishing, spending time with my kids in nature. This weekend we were at the Washington coast razor clamming, for example. Just being in natural environments and generationally is a wellspring that you know you bring back to the work refreshed. You kind of remember why you're doing what you're doing in a very helpful way. I often tell students that when they finish law school, they're clerking with us or spending some season with us. I'll say make sure that you take some time before you take the bar or over summer to go and remember why you're putting yourself through all this, um, and why you're doing this. So um, I think that's very important.
What do you think is some of the most exciting public interest litigation, in food systems happening right now? Like, what should people be paying attention to?
Well, there's some really important work being done with climate and the public trust doctrine and generational rights. There's a new Netflix documentary um, that just came out last week. I forget the name of it, You versus the government or something like that, but it's about some of the climate litigation that's being brought on behalf of teenagers and preteens against the government for failing to do more to address um, climate change. I think advancing really important theories. As we mentioned, the court system, we need to win some elections and we need to get some more judges that view human rights and view environmental rights as fundamental and understand the cases that we're bringing in the world, our view of the technological dilemma and things like that. But in the inner room, I think having things, setting down markers, um, and making waves, um, even if they're in dissents in court opinions. I mean, that's the that's the long journey of social change. I think it's Mother Jones who says that, the history of social movements is you struggle and fail, you struggle and fail, you struggle and fail, you struggle and succeed. So even if a legal theory that we bring now isn't successful, um, if I bring it, I'm creating a pathway that potentially someone can succeed, my daughter perhaps, or maybe it takes another generation um, in the future. And so I gain a lot of hope from that, knowing that the things I write, the cases we bring, the causes that we champion, even if they currently aren't successful, are creating these pathways that can be successful in the future. And in turn, when we do succeed, we almost always stand on the shoulders of past generations. The founders of the environmental movement in the 1960s, Rachel Carson and others of that time, for example, is certainly not on our own. But I think there's some really important cases to get very specific, actually, having to do with people's right to know in the food, what they eat and what they feed their families, and the battle for the label, because I think a lot of our food decisions are made in the grocery store, and so what information we have and how meaningful that information is really important because of that really critical interface and decision context for most Americans. And I think there's also some really important um, litigation right now that is raising the broader impacts of industrial agriculture on the environment and its impacts on endangered species and on climate change. Agriculture usually gets a pass when it comes to climate, even though it's a major contributor to the crisis. And so I think, environmentally, those are two areas to really keep an eye on. As well as kind of more in the consumer realm and how we can really improve access to not just information for consumers, but meaningful information, the information they want, and the information in a form that they can understand and apply, in the store.
I think we all remember the battle for labeling. I know you were incredibly active and engaged in both California, Washington, and Oregon fighting for GE labeling. Um, can you talk a little bit about that battle and where it's at and what you learned as a leader?
Yeah. Um, it's funny. I feel like I've worked on that issue my whole career. I definitely have, and even it started um, before me. But you mentioned the ballot initiatives. I co-authored three different ballot initiatives on the mandatory labeling of genetically engineered food. First one in California, and then in 2000, 2012, in Washington 2013, Oregon 2014, and then we also helped support and pass legislation in other states that were similar to the ballot initiatives. What I learned from the ballot initiative fight, it harkens back to what I mentioned earlier, which is which side can pile the most money on the scale. I mean, in the Oregon fight, we lost by 800 votes, 838 votes. It's still the closest election in Oregon history, even though they outspent us 5-1 and crushed the ballot spending record. Same thing in Washington. We lost 51% to 49%. Again, Monsanto, Coca-Cola, other companies crushed the state record for ballot spending. Same thing in California the year before. But through the ballot initiatives, even though we lost, we won because these other states were Vermont, Connecticut, and Maine were able to pass legislation. And eventually, the passage of their legislation, after we helped defend it from challenges from the Grocery Manufacturers Association and federal court, led to the federal law passing in 2016, which was the first ever nationwide um, genetically engineered food labeling law in the US. Now, unfortunately, that law left a lot to be desired because the companies that were unhappy with our state laws that we had helped champion and draft found a venue much more to their liking in Congress. And like a lot of legislation, it was certainly a compromise in passing what's known as the federal bioengineered disclosure standard. And so, to answer your question, to get to the end of your question, Ashley, currently we're challenging that federal law and its implementing rules for not being good enough in various ways. One of which is that it allows companies to hide the information in a QR code scan on your phone, which requires consumers to go around and scan dozens, if they have a smartphone and if they live in an area that has broadband in their supermarket, to scan dozens of items. And as a parent with small children, I can tell you how impracticable and impossible that is in a grocery store to even contemplate, as well as discriminating against large segments of the population. As I mentioned, rural areas, minorities, the elderly that don't have smartphones. We're also challenging other aspects of the law, the prohibition on states improving and private actors like co-ops that want to do better and provide more information. The fact they use this new term bioengineered that nobody's ever heard of, despite the fact that for decades now, anyone involved in this area has used genetically engineered or genetically modified. Excuse me. And the fact that the law exempts highly processed foods like sodas and oils, which is the vast majority of genetically engineered foods. So, and that case is proceeding to trial and summary judgment later this year. So that's very exciting. We filed that case, I think, about 2 years ago now, and we've been proceeding through district court on it. And we're hoping to have a decision later this year, by the end of the year.
I love this example because you get a smattering of all the different strategies for social change. So for our listeners, GE labeling strikes at the heart of this broader ideological battle for the future of our food. And sort of in the small scale, local, regenerative, organic, and beyond worldview, our assumption is that if people understood that they were eating genetically engineered foods, and they understood that genetic engineering is the gateway to herbicides into the food supply, because we remember that until crops were genetically engineered, if you sprayed them with an herbicide, they die. So if folks understood this, they probably would vote with their dollars in a different way. And so community activists across the United States went to the ballot initiative process, I'm assuming because they felt like they couldn't move it through the legislative process for all the moneyed interest reasons that you talked about. And what we saw in those ballot initiative processes is that these companies leveraged their massive financial resources to stop people's right to know whether or not genetically engineered ingredients and the herbicides they allow into the food supply, to know whether or not they were consuming those products. These community activists, I mean, this is right in my baby days at Center for Food Safety. The world felt alive with efficacy. I mean, it felt incredible that so many people were going door to door, getting petitions signed. They were educating one another. They were advocating for participation in food systems activism. I don't know if food systems activism had a bigger clarion call nationally that like, it's time to engage. And we lose by the tiniest margins of error. And yet activists still are able to carry that battle forward, pass it through their legislative processes in more liberal states. And that brings forward this broader federal law, which was a little bit of a falsie, which we see actually that sometimes we think we're passing a law and then it gets hollowed out at the last minute. And now we're left with QR codes. And so CFS, continuing on in this battle, is now serving in the public interest by suing the government to say that the law that they pass doesn't actually serve all people. And you, following this whole battle, continue to feel that litigation is the way to go.
Yeah, it's funny when I go to 7-Eleven with my daughter, after soccer sometimes she'll want to go there and I'll say, okay, fine. And we 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 have a fun game where we'll find the genetically engineered, produced with genetic engineering labeling on the product, and I'll say, I can't tell you how many years I fought for those three little words right there, whatever it is, sweet tarts or, whatever candy bar or whatever it is, because they're all produced with GE. But absolutely right, Ashley. I mean, I think it is a great example in all those different ways. I mean, what I like to say is the GE food battle is a proxy, sorry, more military
Yes, it's
examples.
fine.
It's a proxy war for the larger battle that we've been talking about the future of our food, for the reasons that you put so well, which is that it represents, that's their vision, this type of food, this industrial food. And so giving people the choice to choose differently and say, no, thank you. I'm going to choose a different future for our food. So it's the tip of the spear in this proxy war over the future of our food. So it's important in and of itself for what it means, but it's more important because it educates people about this divide and about this choice that we have as a society for how we choose to produce our food and what we want to feed our families.
Something that I think I emphasized in our conversation with Charlie Tebbett, another lawyer in the good fight for a better earth, but playing a different role than public interest law, was helping folks to understand also the differentiation of this moment, which is that only the government can provide equal protection to all people. Certainly, we as educated consumers can to opt out of the industrial food system through our dollars. We can choose to buy local, organic foods. But only the government can prevent certain ingredients, certain chemicals, certain toxins from entering the food supply or raising awareness when those toxins are present. And so I think for a lot of folks, it's understanding that we need to do more than shop with our dollars. We also need to fight to change the rules of the game so that these companies are held accountable for the adverse impacts that they're having, not only on people's lives, like obesity, heart disease, diabetes, but also on our environment, because we know that the growing of genetically engineered crops is the silent decimator for so many of our insect species, our plant species, and just the broader rural ecosystems upon which our entire planet relies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the um, the the sorry, I'm spacing out here for a second. I had a point I wanted to make.
We were talking about how this is about getting the government to do their job.
Oh, right. We should change our light bulbs and recycle, but we're not going to save the planet doing that. So on our side, we need all the tools in the toolkit. If you want to go to law school, great. I think we need more lawyers that are doing the good work. And one of the reasons, the main reason I teach is to try to bring what I've learned to the school and to excite students that are already at a great institution and are there with a public interest kind of bent towards the food system and reforming it, dismantling it. And I'm proud that we have several lawyers on our staff now that have, come through my class. But for the most part, we need so many scientists. We need scientists that are willing to work on policy issues and not just be, in a laboratory or in the White Tower of academia and put their skill set to that work. We need campaigners, we need organizers, we need media. So I think it's an exciting time. That there's a lot going on as far as causes, social causes, as we've been discussing, and for young people, I'm encouraged that I see younger people that do seem public interest motivated, unlike I think most people in my own generation that I didn't find to be public interest motivated. Um, but it's going to take more than marketplace changes. We have, I think, voluntary, the track record of voluntary measures and market-based measures to change um, and solve big problems, societal problems or environmental problems, or food system problems is abysmal. So yes, you can have great private labels and certifications, for example, but you need a federal organic standard to set a floor and say, no, we're going to have a different uh, required regulatory system that's transparent and means something. It means no GMOs, no pesticides, no sewage sludge. And from there, you can improve on that through market-based systems. So we need to view government as an important effectuator of public good and there to serve for us. I think our society right now, unfortunately, the far right has a good job villainizing the government and saying that it's not serving a public good. And so, for the most part, when it's captured by corporate interest, um, that's true. But the idea of having a social safety network and having a government that provides benefits for society um, is hugely important. And the only way that we're going to solve some of these big problems is going to be through empowering and breathing life into those tools, legal and otherwise.
Yeah, one of my hopes for this podcast is we highlight and kind of dig into the details of folks' journeys in activism and heroism is to help highlight the necessary role of government. I mean, I think one of the other effects of sort of this emerging conservative culture is that we have lost our respect for public service, for serving in governmental and regulatory agencies with real sort of public interest in mind. Folks aren't running for office because of just the gamesmanship that elections have now required. And as a result, I always tell folks, well, the legislative process is going on, and we can be mad that corporations have taken it over, but we're also not there. So can you really be mad that they want a battle that we, the public, haven't showed up to? And so I hope that folks see these sort of on-ramps into activism through public interest law or public interest legal and policy advocacy as a necessary tool in the toolkit, because that's why we formed this government thing in the first place, was because there is a point of having some sort of institutional bodies protecting people and ever more our environment and our four-legged friends.
Yeah, amen. I mean, a lot of what we do, unfortunately, is trying to watchdog and ensure the government's doing its job. And then if they're not, we do it for them. But I'd much prefer that they actually just did their job more of the time, because then, I'd have more time to go fly fishing. So that'd be good.
Yeah, well, to more time, let's figure that's going to be my next advocacy work, is how to create more time.
That's right.
I think that's a good place to end. So we thank you. I mean, any last, what's the greatest piece of advice you've ever received as an activist that you could share with our listeners as they're contemplating their own journeys into activism and change making?
Mm. Well, um, I'm pretty fond of this Teddy Roosevelt quote up here on my wall.
Mm,
That's probably the one that I go to the most often. I should have it memorized by now, but it's the famous quote about the man in the arena. So it's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit is to the man or woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly and errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and who spends herself on a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if she fails, at least she fails while daring greatly, so that their place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither victory nor defeat.
mm. It's a good one. And so what do you take from that? Like, how do you walk away? Just to stay in the arena and keep fighting?
Yeah, I mean, be in the arena. Find your arena. Find your arena and be in it. And don't worry about what anybody else is saying about how you're not doing well enough or um, how maybe you're putting things at risk or um, you're not succeeding. Whatever the criticisms are, whatever the critics are saying, don't worry about any of that. Just be in the arena and spend yourself on a worthy cause, on a great devotion. We have a limited amount of time on this earth. And, if you're a lawyer, do you want to go spend that at a law firm, like basically shuffling money from one corporation to another with doing the moral equivalent of crossword puzzles? Is that how you want to spend your intellect?